Are you certain you live in a world where stones remember history? Look around. What you consider venerable antiquity may in fact be fresh concrete and ancient castles, political stage sets of the 19th century. We are used to trusting architecture as the most honest witness, but it is the stones that have learned to lie most skillfully of all. For centuries, rulers, ideologues, and restorers have rewritten the past not only in books, but in granite. We are faced with the phenomenon of architectural forgery, where entire eras were erased from the landscape and convenient myths were erected in their place. Restoration often turned into a surgical operation to amputate incorrect memory. In this series, we will conduct an audit of world heritage. We will see how Victorian fanatics cleaned the Tower of London, how Prussian engineers Germanized Polish fortresses, and how 20th century dictators built antiquity using steam cranes. This is not just a story about art. It is a detective investigation into how our authentic past was stolen and replaced with safe, pompous replicas. Prepare yourself. After this, you will never be able to look at old buildings with the same eyes. We begin in the very heart of London. Do you think the Tower is the grim fortress of William the Conqueror? In reality, it is a Disneyland of the Victorian era. Are you ready to find out how many medieval buildings had to be demolished just to make the castle look medieval enough? The Tower is the symbol of the unshakable English monarchy. Millions of tourists come here every year to touch the 11th century. But the irony is that the fortress's current appearance is the fruit of the imagination of 19th century architects who decided that real history looked too untidy and insufficiently heroic. In the mid-1800s, British authorities launched a massive cleanup. Architects Anthony Salvin and Sidney Smirke decided to return the Tower to its true medieval spirit. The problem was that over 800 years, the fortress had grown with real life. There were residential annexes, warehouses, workshops, and administrative buildings from various eras. All of this was declared architectural trash and ruthlessly demolished. In place of living history, stylized replicas arose. The White Tower was purged of the layers of time, and its walls were refaced to look like a picture from a chivalric romance. The restorers were not preserving the past. They were editing it, tailoring it to Victorian standards of pathos and austerity. What we see today is a frozen stage set, created in the age of steam engines, masquerading as a grim Norman citadel. But if the English at least tried to stick to a single style, in Eastern Europe, architectural restoration turned into a tool of ideological warfare. Are you ready to see how entire cities were dressed in German clothing to erase any trace of Slavic presence? We are heading to Malbork, Poland. Malbork Castle, Marienburg, is the largest brick fortress in the world. Today it stands as the pride of Poland and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. However, its current appearance is not so much the legacy of the Teutonic Knights as it is a gargantuan ideological manifesto of 19th century Prussia. The Germans transformed these ruins into a symbol of their superiority, literally molding an ideal past out of fresh brick. By the beginning of the 19th century, the castle was in decay. It housed warehouses, barracks, and even a weaving factory. But when Prussia began searching for its roots, Marienburg was designated the primary sanctuary of the German spirit. Architect Konrad Steinbrecht devoted decades to cleansing the castle of Polish and Baroque layers. His motto was simple: if it doesn't look German and knightly, tear it down. Steinbrecht didn't just restore, he reimagined. If actual blueprints were missing, he designed as it should have been. The result was a sterile, frighteningly correct image of an order fortress. In 1945, the castle was reduced to ruins, and Polish restorers began their own game, rebuilding it once more, but this time as a symbol of victory over Germanization. Malbork is a layer cake of the ambitions of two nations, where every medieval vault conceals a political commission of the modern era. But while the fight in Poland was over style, in France, the father of restoration, Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, went even further. He decided that real castles were boring and began building his own fantasies upon the ruins. Are you ready to see Château de Pierrefonds, which looks like a movie set for King Arthur but hides 19th century technology inside? If you are looking for the quintessential picture book knight's castle, you will find it in Pierrefonds. But be warned, this is not a restoration of history, but a daring reimagining of it. The great and terrible Eugène Viollet-le-Duc transformed a semi-destroyed 14th century ruin into the personal fantasy of Emperor Napoleon III, creating an ideal medieval castle that never actually existed in reality. Viollet-le-Duc was convinced that to restore meant not to preserve, but to bring a building to a state of completeness that might never have existed at any given time. Receiving carte blanche from the emperor, he cast aside boring archaeological accuracy. The architect added towers, invented intricate gargoyles, and planned halls to fit the imperial pathos of the 19th century, rather than the practical needs of the past. Inside this medieval giant were hidden the cutting-edge engineering solutions of the time: complex heating systems and steel frames. Pierrefonds is a brilliant forgery, an architectural novel written in stone. Viollet-le-Duc created the standard of Gothic that everyone, including Walt Disney, would later look to. We look at these walls and see the Middle Ages, but in reality, it is a frozen manifesto of Romanticism and the technological superiority of the Industrial Age. Viollet-le-Duc fixed dozens of sites across France, including the famous Carcassonne. But what happens when restoration turns into a total cleansing of a city? We move to Carcassonne to see how, for the sake of purity of style, entire generations were thrown out of their homes, turning a living city into a lifeless museum showcase. Carcassonne is the ideal medieval fortified city we know from movies and board games. But behind its flawless silhouette lies a tragedy. To create this postcard image, Viollet-le-Duc literally sterilized the city, destroying hundreds of years of authentic history for the sake of a contrived purity of style. In the mid-19th century, Carcassonne was a chaos. Poor men's shacks, smithies, and shops huddled in the gaps between the double walls. To romantic restorers, this was filth. Viollet-le-Duc ordered the demolition of everything that did not fit his vision of the chivalric era. Thousands of residents were evicted, and their homes, which had clung to the walls for centuries, were razed. The architect replaced the flat roofs, typical of southern France, with sharp northern-style spires because they looked more heroic. He added towers where none had ever existed and corrected the masonry, erasing the traces of past sieges and rebuilds. Consequently, Carcassonne was transformed from a living city into a dead stage set. It was a triumph of aesthetics over reality. The world gained a beautiful picture but lost the genuine historical context. While they were cleansing style in France, in Prague, restorers committed a true architectural forgery. Are you ready to find out how the primary symbol of the Czech Republic, St. Vitus Cathedral, was turned into an ancient masterpiece just 100 years ago, when trams were already running through the streets? You stand frozen in the Prague castle before the grand facade of St. Vitus Cathedral, certain that you are looking at the legacy of Charles IV. But look at the dates. The western facade and the two main towers were only completed in 1929. The ultimate symbol of Czech history is a new build of the electrical age, masterfully disguised as the grim Middle Ages. The cathedral stood unfinished for nearly 500 years, with a gaping hole where the central nave should have been. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that it was taken seriously. Restorers Mocker and Cranach decided not just to finish the building, but to purge it of all traces of Baroque and Renaissance that had accumulated over the centuries. They literally carved out pieces of real history to insert modern imitations of 14th century Gothic. This was a project to create a national myth. Builders used steam cranes and modern calculations to erect vaults that ancient architects simply could not have supported. When the cathedral was officially opened in 1929, the world saw an ancient masterpiece that was actually younger than the first telephone. We look at these walls and see the power of the House of Luxembourg, but we touch stone that has barely had time to cool from the chisels of last century's craftsmen. But if in Prague they were finishing a cathedral, in Vienna and Budapest, architects took an even bolder step. They began building antiquity from scratch, simply so the buildings would look worthy. Are you ready to see the Hungarian Parliament, which pretends to be a Gothic cathedral while being a contemporary of New York's first skyscrapers? Looking at the Hungarian Parliament building, you might believe it is a castle from ancient legends. In reality, it is a grand architectural masquerade. Completed in 1904, it is a contemporary of the first automobiles. This is not a legacy of the ages, but a conscious choice by an era that was ashamed of its industrial nakedness and hid steel beams beneath neo-Gothic lace. At the end of the 19th century, a fever of historicism gripped Europe. In Vienna and Budapest, new ministries, courts, and theatres were erected on the principle of choose your own era. The Hungarian parliament was built as a symbol of national rebirth. Inside, it was an ultra-modern facility with cutting-edge ventilation and lighting systems. But outside, it was wrapped in 40 million bricks and 500,000 precious stones in the Gothic style. In Vienna, on the Ringstrasse, the situation was even more absurd. The city hall was built as Gothic, the parliament as ancient Greek, and the university as Renaissance. All were created simultaneously, from the same materials, before the eyes of a single generation. It was a massive project to falsify urban space. Cities rapidly changing under the blows of industrialization were being artificially injected with genetic memory through stage sets. We see the grandeur of empires, but in truth, it is the triumph of decorators from the age of steam. However, Europe's architectural games seem innocent compared to what happened in Egypt. Are you ready to see photographs where the pyramids and the Sphinx are literally reassembled from scratch in the 1920s? We are heading to Giza to find out how much concrete is hidden within the eternal stones. We are told that the great monuments of Giza have stood unshakable for thousands of years. But look at the archival photos from the 1920s. The pyramids are surrounded by tracks where steam engines haul tons of stone and cement, and the Sphinx is literally being sculpted anew from brick and plaster. Eternity, it turns out, was in need of a major overhaul that changed its appearance forever. In the early 20th century, the Sphinx was a sorry sight, an erosion-eaten lump barely resembling a lion. Between 1925 and 1936, engineer Émile Barrés's team conducted a restoration that looked more like a reconstruction. The Sphinx's paws we see today are modern brick facing hiding a shapeless base. The Egyptian authorities sought to create a perfect tourist attraction, and excess details or traces of decay were simply plastered over. The situation with the pyramids is no better. In the 1930s, they were aggressively cleaned, removing piles of stones that had accumulated at the base for centuries. But along with the debris, authentic fragments of the casing disappeared as well. Restorers used cement mortars to bind the blocks and reset stones where they believed they ought to lie. We aren't looking at the original geometry of antiquity, but at the work of Jazz-Age archaeologists who strove to make the ruins more photogenic for the first mass tourists. While in Egypt, restorers worked with stone, in Great Britain in 1954, archaeologists tackled the megaliths of Stonehenge with heavy cranes. Are you ready to see the images where ancient stones hang from steel cables before being permanently set in concrete? Do you believe in the magical energy of stones arranged by druids? Archival photos from 1954 might shatter that illusion. They capture modern cranes carefully lowering multi-ton boulders into their correct positions. Stonehenge in its current form is not a monument frozen in time, but the result of a massive engineering redesign from the mid-20th century. Until the beginning of the 20th century, Stonehenge was a chaotic heap of fallen stones. In 1901, 1919, and finally between 1954 and 1958, British archaeologists decided to restore the monument's former greatness. Under the direction of Richard Atkinson, a radical reconstruction was carried out. Fallen stones were lifted by cranes, moved, and set into freshly dug pits that were filled with concrete for stability. During these works, the ancient megaliths were arranged as the scientists of the time believed they should stand, according to their theories about observatories. Some stones were replaced with concrete imitations, others were trimmed. What we see today is not an authentic object, but an idealized model of antiquity assembled according to the blueprints of romantic archaeologists. It is a British theme park where 20th century concrete serves as the foundation for Neolithic myths. But if the English were at least working with real stones, the Chinese took the path of total reproduction. Are you ready to find out why those sections of the Great Wall of China you see on postcards smell like fresh cement and were built specifically for Mao Zedong? Do you believe this endless stone snake has stood here since the time of the first emperors? Prepare for disappointment. Those perfect crenellated walls where millions of tourists walk today are actually fresh concrete and brick laid in the 1950s and 80s. Most of the ancient wall is a massive replica, created so that China would have a symbol it wasn't ashamed to show the world. The real Great Wall, for the most part, looked like an inconspicuous earthen rampart or piles of unrefined stone. It crumbled over time, and by the mid-20th century, only fragments barely visible on the landscape remained. But Communist China needed a powerful national symbol. In 1952, Mao Zedong initiated the restoration project of the Badaling section near Beijing. What we see today, with its even steps, embrasures, and majestic towers, is an architectural fantasy of modern builders. They didn't restore the old. They built an ideal wall from scratch using modern mortars and masonry techniques. Old photographs from the beginning of the century show only pathetic ruins in the place of today's tourist meccas. In essence, China built a giant attraction that it successfully passes off as one of the wonders of antiquity. It is not a defensive structure, it is a monument to modern marketing. But while the Chinese built on the sites of old ramparts, something even more daring was happening in Europe. There is a whole series of Gothic cathedrals officially considered jewels of the 13th century, yet their spires were erected using steam cranes when trains were already running through the streets. Are you ready to learn the secret of Cologne Cathedral? Do you believe that the black spires of Cologne Cathedral are a greeting from the deep Middle Ages? Look at the dates. The cathedral, founded in 1248, stood as a derelict skeleton for nearly 3 centuries. Its current appearance is the result of a massive 19th century construction project, born when German nationalism decided to acquire a sanctuary using the sheer power of the Industrial Revolution. By the 1840s, the cathedral was a pitiful sight, only a quarter finished, with temporary roofs and a 14th century crane frozen over an incomplete tower. For the new Prussia, this was unacceptable. Architects found old blueprints, whose authenticity is still debated, and launched a grand project to complete the masterpiece. But this was no old-fashioned restoration. Advanced technology was used to erect the giant spires, steel beams, steam engines, and a railway to haul the stone. 19th century architects didn't just copy Gothic style, they scaled it, making the towers taller and heavier than the masters of the past could ever have afforded. When construction finished in 1880, the world saw not an ancient cathedral, but a triumph of Bismarck-era engineering, masterfully disguised as a Gothic myth. Yet if Cologne at least stood on an old foundation, what about entire cities that were redressed in a matter of decades? Are you ready to see how Baron Haussmann erased the real medieval Paris from the face of the earth to build the stage set we consider ancient today? The Paris you adore, with its wide boulevards and uniform facades, is not an old city. It is a cleansing project implemented by Baron Haussmann in the mid-19th century. To create this postcard look, the authorities demolished 20,000 medieval houses. The real living Paris was sacrificed for the sake of imperial pathos and the convenience of suppressing uprisings. Until the 1850s, Paris was a labyrinth of narrow alleys that remembered the musketeers. But Napoleon III needed a city where cavalry could disperse crowds and cannons could fire straight down the avenues. Haussmann acted like a surgeon. He sliced through the body of the city with straight lines, destroying entire neighborhoods. It wasn't just buildings that vanished. 500 years of cultural layers disappeared. In place of the demolished history, standardized buildings arose. What we today call Parisian style is the result of strict regulations. The height of the roofs, the slope of the attics, and the color of the stone were dictated by the state. Paris was transformed into a giant, aesthetically flawless barrack. We admire this harmony without realizing that it is built on the ashes of the real Middle Ages, which were deemed unphotogenic and dangerous to the regime. But if Paris was combed over for safety, in other countries, entire buildings were simply moved through space. Are you ready to find out how Soviet engineers moved multi-ton buildings on rails so they wouldn't interfere with parades, literally rewriting the geography of Moscow overnight? You go to sleep in a historic mansion on Tverskaya Street and wake up 50 meters deeper into the courtyard. In the 1930s, Soviet engineers turned Moscow into a giant construction set. To widen the streets for Stalin's parades, multi-ton stone giants were placed on rollers and transported from place to place without turning off the water or electricity. The city's history literally rolled away on tracks. Stalin's reconstruction of Moscow demanded wide avenues, but excess historical buildings stood in the way of progress. Instead of demolishing everything, it was decided to move unique structures. The Savinskoye Podvorye, weighing 23,000 tons, was moved in a single night while the residents slept, a world record at the time. Buildings were sliced from their foundations, supported by massive frames, and rolled along specially laid tracks. This was not merely an engineering victory, but an act of total control over space. The authorities were demonstrating that architecture no longer held power over man. We could change the landscape at our discretion. As a result, Moscow turned into a hybrid city where ancient churches and tenement houses found themselves pushed behind the facades of new monumental buildings, losing their original connection to the land and their context. But while in Moscow houses were moved for the sake of roads, in other parts of the world, entire cities vanished from maps simply because their existence contradicted the official version of land settlement. Are you ready to see the ghost cities on 18th century maps that are officially considered errors, yet look too detailed to be fiction? Open European atlases of the 17th and 18th centuries, in the places where, according to modern textbooks, there should be wild steppes, hundreds of cities with coats of arms and fortress walls are drawn. We are told these are cartographic errors. But how could professional geographers, whose maps cost fortunes, mistake an entire civilization? On the maps of Mercator, Hondius, and Delisle, vast expanses of Eurasia and North America are filled with toponyms that appear on no map today. The cities of Grustina, Serpanov, Caspia, they are marked as developed centers with clear layouts. Official history claims that the cartographers of the past simply filled the void with fantasies. However, these fantasies are surprisingly consistent across the maps of different masters for over 100 years. The disappearance of these cities coincides with the period of the Great Cleansing of archives and the rewriting of history in the 18th and 19th centuries. When new empires began to divide the world, old centers of power became an obstacle. They were declared mythical, erased from globes, and their ruins were dismissed as the remains of temporary nomad camps. We are dealing with a global editing of the planet. Entire cultural layers were declared non-existent to create the illusion of a virgin land that only attained civilization under the rule of current capitals. But if cities can be erased from paper, what about artifacts found deep underground in the wrong layers? Are you ready to learn about objects older than humanity that look like parts of modern mechanisms? We move to the topic of out-of-place artifacts. What if gold chains are found in coal seams millions of years old, and iron nails are discovered inside solid rock? Official science calls these hoaxes because acknowledging them would mean admitting that human history is thousands of times longer or shorter than we were taught. These out-of-place artifacts, OOP arts, are inconvenient pieces of evidence that have been gathering dust in museum storerooms for years. The list of finds that blow historians' minds is vast. From the Baghdad battery, hinting at electricity in antiquity, to the Antikythera mechanism, an analog computer from ancient Greece. When an iron hammer is found in rock from the Mesozoic era, scientists have two choices: declare it a joke of nature or revise the entire theory of evolution. Most often, such finds are lost or declared forgeries without deep expert analysis. The archaeological paradigm is extremely rigid. If an object does not fit into the linear timeline, from digging stick to smartphone, it is easier to ignore it. We see only the part of the puzzle that we were permitted to assemble. But the real history of Earth may turn out to be a cyclic series of rises and falls of civilizations, leaving behind nothing but strange iron scraps in chunks of anthracite. But if artifacts can be hidden, how do you hide enormous structures? Are you ready to see the megaliths of Baalbek, where stones weighing 1,000 tons are fitted so tightly that not even a blade can be slid between them? Is this the technology of gods or a forgotten engineering that we cannot replicate even today? In the Lebanese mountains lie stones that make modern engineers blush with helplessness. This is Baalbek. Here, in the foundation of the Temple of Jupiter, lie three monoliths, the Trilithon, weighing 800 tons each. Officially, the Romans quarried and dragged them here, but there is one problem. The Roman Empire had no cranes or winches capable of even moving such a mass, let alone achieving jewelry-level precision fitting at a height of 7 meters. The Romans, arriving in Baalbek, found a massive megalithic base already prepared, which they simply used as a foundation for their own buildings. The difference in the masonry is visible to the naked eye. Elegant Roman columns stand on cyclopean blocks that look like the product of a completely different, more powerful technology. How were these blocks transported from a quarry a kilometer away? How were they lifted? In a nearby quarry, the stone of the south still lies, weighing over 1,000 tons, never fully separated from the bedrock. It bears no traces of chisels or wedges. It looks as if it were cut by a giant milling machine. We are faced with material evidence of a forgotten civilization of giant builders, whose technical capabilities surpassed our own. This isn't magic, it's forgotten physics that historians try to pass off as the labor of thousands of slaves with ropes. But if Baalbek is a mystery of the past, what about the mysteries being created right now? Are you ready to admit that one of the most expensive and famous projects of modern times, the Sagrada Familia, is being built using technologies Gaudi never dreamed of, turning the cathedral into history's first AI-generated temple? Antonio Gaudi left behind only sketches and fragments of models, which were almost completely destroyed in the fires of the Civil War. What is being completed in Barcelona today is not the master's vision, but the result of complex algorithms and 3D modeling. The Sagrada Familia is the world's first cathedral designed by artificial intelligence based on assumptions of what the author intended to convey. After Gaudi's death, construction proceeded blindly for decades. Modern architects admit that the forms of the Sagrada Familia are so complex they are impossible to calculate using traditional methods. To complete the towers, engineers use fighter jet design software and neural networks. Stones are carved on CNC machines with millimeter precision, turning a mystical construction site into a high-tech assembly line. We admire the organic curves of the temple, considering them the fruit of divine inspiration, but in reality, they are a triumph of mathematical optimization. What we see today is a 21st century interpretation stretched over an early 20th century frame. The Sagrada Familia has become a symbol of a new reality. When the original is lost, technology creates an improved copy that looks more authentic than what the master himself could have produced. But what if tomorrow, artificial intelligence decides to restore our entire history at once? We have reached the finale. Are you ready to see how fake antiquity became the foundation of our worldview and why we will never see the real past again? Why does the Palace of Knossos on Crete look so vibrant and modern? The answer is simple. It is not a restoration, but the personal artistic interpretation of archaeologist Arthur Evans. At the beginning of the 20th century, he didn't just dig up the ruins of the Minoan civilization. He literally rebuilt them from concrete, painting the walls as his imagination dictated. Evans arrived in Crete in 1900 and found only foundations and heaps of stones. Instead of conserving the finds, he decided to bring the labyrinth of the Minotaur to life. He erected columns, ceilings, and entire halls using materials that were modern at the time. Those famous red columns and bright frescoes with dolphins are largely the product of Evans' artists' fantasies, who reconstructed entire scenes from just a few surviving fragments of plaster. Today, scholars call Knossos the concrete palace. Evans effectively destroyed the archaeological context, replacing it with an Art Nouveau stage set. We aren't seeing Minoan culture. We are seeing how a British gentleman of the Victorian era imagined it. The Palace of Knossos is a monument not to antiquity, but to the audacity of an archaeologist who decided to become a co-author of history. But while they built with concrete on Crete, in Greece, the Parthenon has for decades been turned into a giant jigsaw puzzle where the pieces don't fit. Are you ready to find out why the ultimate sanctuary of antiquity is still surrounded by scaffolding, and how much original stone is actually left there? The Parthenon in Athens is the ultimate symbol of architectural perfection. But if you look closely at the columns, you will see strange patches of dazzling white marble against the backdrop of the yellowed original. This is the result of a restoration that has been ongoing for nearly 50 years. The irony: to assemble this jigsaw puzzle, architects had to correct the mistakes of 19th century restorers who managed to put parts of the temple together backward. In the 1890s, engineer Nikolaos Balanos decided to restore the Parthenon. He acted quickly and crudely, using iron pins and clamps to fasten the blocks. The iron began to rust, expand, and literally tear the ancient marble apart from the inside. Moreover, Balanos didn't care much for precision. He swapped blocks around, placing fragments of one column onto another. Since 1975, Greek authorities have been trying to fix this chaos. Modern restorers use computer modeling to find the native place for each piece among thousands of fragments. New marble from the same Dionysos quarry used in antiquity is employed. What we see today is a hybrid. The Parthenon is effectively being reassembled from scratch, attempting to separate ancient genius from the blunders of Victorian builders. It is a temple being physically reborn in our time. But while Greece fights for every centimeter of authenticity, in Spain they decided on a radical experiment. Are you ready to see Matrera Castle, which was restored to look like a concrete bunker, sparking fury in some and delight in fans of modern art? In 2016, the Spanish fortress of Matrera became a global sensation and a laughingstock simultaneously. After the 9th century ancient tower partially collapsed, restorers unveiled the result of their labor. Instead of familiar stonework, the world saw a giant grey concrete monolith with original wall fragments jutting out like orphans. Is this an architectural crime or an honest look at history? Architect Carlos Quevedo Rojas stated that his goal was not to forge antiquity, but to achieve consolidation. By his logic, finishing the tower with fake stone would mean lying to the viewer. Instead, he used concrete to show the exact volume of the building as it was originally, while preserving the authentic fragments as precious exhibits. The public was outraged, comparing the project to a DIY repair job. However, the professional community awarded the project a prestigious architectural prize. Matrera became a symbol of the end of the era of romantic restoration. They are no longer trying to sell us a beautiful fairy tale. They are showing us the brutal truth that time is ruthless, and all we can do is place a concrete prop under the ruins of the past. But if the Spaniards used concrete to shock, in Latin America, archaeologists ignored entire metropolises hidden under layers of jungle for centuries. Are you ready to learn about the LiDAR laser revolution, which proved that our history textbooks missed cities of millions in Guatemala? We are accustomed to thinking that the Maya civilization consisted of a few scattered pyramids in the middle of the dense Guatemalan jungle. But in 2018, laser scanning technology, LiDAR, literally wiped the forest off the maps and exposed a shocking truth. Hidden beneath the tree canopy was not a collection of villages, but a megalopolis of 60,000 structures. For decades, we walked over the ruins of some of the world's greatest cities, mistaking them for ordinary hills. LiDAR works like an X-ray for archaeologists. Laser pulses penetrate thick vegetation to build a precise 3D model of the terrain. What was revealed to researchers overturned all previous demographic estimates. It turned out that the Maya had created a highly complex irrigation system, giant defensive ramparts, and highways connecting cities. The population of the region was not 2 million, but closer to 15 to 20 million people. This discovery raises a question. How many other great empires are hidden beneath the forests of the Amazon or the sands of the Sahara? Official history claims that jungles cannot sustain massive populations, but the Maya proved the opposite. We didn't just find new ruins, we discovered that our perception of the wild nature of the past is merely a facade hiding the industrial landscapes of antiquity. But while the Maya hid cities in the forests, in Russia, entire ancient settlements are being found where they shouldn't exist, according to all established canons. Are you ready to hear about Archaim and the land of cities? Why does this find in the Urals frighten apologists of classical history so much that they try to turn it into a mystical reserve? In 1987, in the southern Urals, a city was found that, by all laws of history, should have been in Greece or Mesopotamia, but certainly not in the steppes of the Chelyabinsk region. Archaeum is a settlement approximately 4,000 years old, with such flawless circular planning and complex storm drainage that archaeologists at first did not believe their eyes. This was not a nomadic camp, but a high-tech scientific and metallurgical center of the Bronze Age. Archaeum is part of the Land of Cities, which includes dozens of fortified settlements. The precision with which the walls and houses were built is staggering. The city's architecture is oriented toward the stars, with a precision comparable to Stonehenge. Each house featured a furnace, a well, and a forced ventilation system that allowed bronze to be smelted directly within the living quarters. The strangest part is that the residents left Archaeum in an organized manner, having first set it on fire. The city was not destroyed by enemies or time, it was preserved by flames. The finds in the Urals prove that a powerful civilization existed here long before the emergence of the states we are familiar with, yet its technology and knowledge vanished along with the smoke of the fires, leaving us to guess who our ancestors truly were. But if Archaeum was hidden under a layer of earth, in India there are temples that look as if they were printed on a giant 3D printer. Are you ready to see the columns of the Hoysaleswara temple, which bear the marks of mechanical lathe turning, impossible for the manual labor of antiquity? In the Indian state of Karnataka stand temples that would baffle any modern technologist. The columns of the Hoysaleswara temple are not merely decorated with carvings, they possess a perfect concentric form with microscopic grooves that can only be achieved by rotating apart at high speeds. Look at these marks. This is not the work of a sculptor's chisel, it is the output of a lathe, which officially did not exist 800 years ago. The columns are made of soapstone, steatite, which hardens over time but is pliable during processing. However, the complexity of the profile and the absolute symmetry of the rings across the entire length of the monolith rule out manual labor. On some details, characteristic cut-ins are visible, micro-defects that occur when a cutting tool chatters on a machine. Furthermore, the temple contains bas-reliefs with details so minute that it would be impossible to carve them without breaking the stone, unless you had a high-speed dental drill. Official accounts state that craftsmen used primitive lever mechanisms and sand polishing. But try to replicate such a column by hand today, it would take decades. The Hoysala temples appear as a demonstration of forgotten machine technologies that vanished along with the dynasty, leaving behind stone evidence of the technical superiority of the past. But what if ancient machines could manipulate not just stones, but entire mountains? Are you ready to see Ellora, where the giant Kailasa temple was not built from blocks but carved from the top down out of a single solid rock, removing 400,000 tons of stone? Where did all that rubbish go? Forget bricks and mortar. The Kailasa temple in India is the largest monolithic structure in the world, but it wasn't built, it was liberated. Ancient masters simply took a mountain and cut away everything superfluous, moving from the top down. Imagine this. 400,000 tons of basalt were extracted from the rock with such precision that the slightest mistake on the upper tiers would have buried the entire project. Traditional archaeology suggests the temple was carved in 20 years using only chisels and hammers. But simple arithmetic blows this version to smithereens. To meet such a deadline, workers would have had to extract 60 tons of rock per day, working around the clock. And this isn't just digging a hole, it's jewelry-grade carving into ultra-hard basalt, creating multi-story halls, bridges, and giant elephant statues. The biggest mystery is, where did those 400,000 tons of stone go? In the vicinity of Ellora, there are no traces of giant debris mounds or evidence of this stone being used in other buildings. The rock simply vanished. Looking at the vertical marks on the walls, it seems as if the mountain was cut with some powerful thermal or plasma tool, like a knife through butter. Kailasa is not architecture, it is an alien or high-tech sculpture on a mountain scale. But if they were cutting cliffs in India, in Lebanon, ancient builders left blanks in a quarry that we cannot lift even today. Are you ready to see the Hajar al-Hibla, a stone weighing 1,200 tons that silences any proponent of the thousands of slaves with ropes theory? In the Baalbek quarry lies the Stone of the South, a monolith officially considered an abandoned Roman workpiece, It weighs approximately 1,000 tons. However, in 2014, another block was discovered beneath it, weighing a staggering 1,650 tons. This is the equivalent of 3 fully loaded Boeing 747 aircraft. To suggest that ancient builders planned to haul this on wooden rollers is to ignore the laws of physics. The wood would simply have been crushed into dust under such immense pressure. Traditional history provides no answer to the question of why. Why quarry a block weighing over 1,500 tons when a wall could be built from 1,000 smaller stones? The logic of megalithic construction is different. It is a demonstration of technologies that are independent of weight. The surfaces of these stones are smooth, and the angles are maintained with incredible precision. The most striking part is that these blocks were not merely quarried, they were prepared for transport. There are no traces of hundreds of levers or chisels on them. They look as though the builders utilized anti-gravity or stone softening techniques and then abruptly halted their work. These blanks in the quarry stand as a silent reproach to official science, which tries to squeeze the capabilities of an unknown super-civilization into the limitations of Roman legionnaires. But if Baalbek represents the gigantism of the past, in Japan, there is a megalith that literally floats in the air. Are you ready to see Ishi no Hoden, the stone ship, which weighs 500 tons and is surrounded by water so that it appears to be sailing in a rocky basin? In the Japanese city of Takasago, there is an object locals call the stone ship. It is a 500-ton monolith that seems to hang suspended over the water. According to official legend, gods carved it in a single night. But from an engineering perspective, it is a giant component of an unknown mechanism left in the middle of a stone quarry thousands of years ago. Ishi no Hoden is unique because it does not rest on the ground. A special reservoir filled with water has been carved beneath it, creating an optical illusion that the colossus is hovering in mid-air. The shape of the megalith has nothing in common with traditional Japanese architecture. It features strange protrusions, resembling slots or plugs, and complex geometric facets. Japanese archaeologists admit there is not a single historical record regarding who created this object, how, or why. It bears no traces of the tools used by people during the Kofun period. It looks like a spare part that was manufactured but never inserted into the final assembly. We are accustomed to thinking that the ancients built only temples and tombs. But Ishi no Hoden forces us to suspect they were building giant machines whose purpose we are simply unable to grasp. But if in Japan machine parts were made of stone, in Egypt, stones were processed at such speeds that the cutting tool must have moved faster than a modern diamond saw. Are you ready to see the sarcophagi of the Serapeum at Saqqara, where the internal corners are finished with sub-micron precision? In the tunnels of Saqqara stand 24 giant, empty sarcophagi made of ultra-hard granite and diorite. Each weighs up to 100 tons. The official version claims these were coffins for mummified Apis bulls. However, there is a problem. Not a single bull mummy was found inside, and the precision of the interior surfaces meets modern industrial standards for optical instruments. Chris Dunn, a well-known researcher of ancient machine technologies, measured these boxes with high-precision tools. The result was staggering. The internal corners are exactly 90 degrees, and the deviation of the lid's flatness from the base is less than the thickness of a human hair. To achieve such a mirror polish on granite today requires computer-controlled CNC machines. Why would the Egyptians spend decades creating perfectly hermetic safes for bulls using technologies we only mastered in the 20th century? There is a theory that the Serapeum was not a cemetery, but a technological facility, perhaps an energy storage site or part of a complex resonance mechanism. The sarcophagi are installed in narrow niches where it is physically impossible to carry them by hand. The gaps between the stone and the cave wall are only a few centimeters wide. This looks like the installation of equipment, not a funeral procession. But if Egypt stuns with precision, Peru shocks with the plasticity of stone. Are you ready to see Sacsayhuaman, a fortress where massive 200-ton boulders are fitted together as if they were made of Play-Doh and simply stuck to one another? The walls of the Sacsayhuaman fortress in Peru are a nightmare for a geologist and a delight for a conspiracy theorist. Enormous boulders, weighing up to 200 tons, are fitted against one another with such incredible curvilinear precision that it is impossible to slide even a sheet of paper between them. This isn't just masonry. The blocks look as if they were softened to the state of plasticine, pressed together, and then solidified, forming a monolithic structure capable of withstanding any earthquake. Official history tells us of long and painstaking tapping of stones with other stones. But look at the angles and convex surfaces. The blocks have a complex three-dimensional shape, interlocking like jigsaw puzzle pieces. To achieve such a fit through trial and error, a 100-ton slab would have to be lifted and lowered thousands of times to check every millimeter. This is physically impossible for a civilization that supposedly did not know the wheel or the crane. Many researchers suggest that the builders possessed technology to soften stone, perhaps using chemical compounds from local plants or intense solar heat focused through lenses. On some stones, dents and marks are visible that look like tool imprints on soft clay. Sacsayhuaman is not architecture in our traditional sense. It is the manipulation of stone as a pliable material, a secret lost long before the arrival of the conquistadors. But if the stones in the mountains of Peru were melted, on the other side of the world, in Pumapunku, they were sliced with laser-like precision. Are you ready to see megaliths that look like parts of a giant Lego set, with perfect internal cuts and holes that are impossible to make with a copper chisel? In Bolivia, at an altitude of nearly 4,000 meters, lie ruins officially designated as a temple of the Tiwanaku people. But forget about temples. Pumapunku looks like a construction site after a global catastrophe. Scattered here are blocks of andesite, one of the hardest stones on the planet, bearing absolutely straight cuts, grooves, and perfect holes, only a few millimeters in diameter. It looks like the output of a high-precision milling machine, not a stone axe. The most striking feature of Pumapunku is the H-blocks. Their geometry is so identical that they are interchangeable. This is the principle of modular parts, which humanity only mastered during the Industrial Revolution. On the blocks, one can see grooves only a couple of millimeters deep, cut with perfect linearity. It is impossible to achieve this by hand without chipping the edge of the stone. Local legends say the city was built in a single night by gods who used sound and light. Archaeologists, meanwhile, attempt to prove that the natives rubbed granite with sand for hours. However, microscopic analysis shows that the surface inside the cuts is as smooth as glass. Pumapunku is material evidence of industrial production in deep antiquity, where stone was used as easily as we use plastic today. We have reached the final point of our marathon. After everything we have seen, from the rewritten cities of Europe to the laser cuts in Bolivia, one question remains. Why are we being lied to so persistently? Are you ready for the final conclusion on how and why the official version of our past was created? We have gone through 29 proofs that the material world around us does not match what is written in textbooks. Why does official science so fiercely resist the obvious? Because history is not a search for truth, it is the foundation of legitimacy for the current system. To admit the existence of a high-tech past is to admit that we are not at the peak of progress, but are merely trying to recover after a global reset. The entire body of knowledge about the past passes through a rigid filter. Finds that do not fit the linear model of from cave to iPhone are labeled out-of-place artifacts and sent to closed archives. This is convenient. If the past is primitive, then the current elites are the pinnacle of evolution. If, however, civilizations existed before us that knew how to move 1,000-ton blocks and heal diseases with sound, then all of our modern science turns into a collection of cargo cults. Architectural hoaxes, concrete antiquities, and the scrubbed maps of Tartaria are tools for creating a unified matrix of perception. We have been built a cozy past where everything is clear and logical, but the cracks in this facade, in Baalbek, Ellora, or Pumapunku, allow us to peer into the abyss of real history. We are not the first intelligent civilization on this planet, and judging by the cyclicity of catastrophes, we will not be the last. We are used to trusting stone more than paper. Stone does not lie, or so it seems. But as we walk past the spires of Cologne, the walls of Carcassonne, and the concrete-reinforced megaliths of Stonehenge, we see the truth. Our past is a carefully edited draft created over the last 150 years. The world we live in is a grand exhibition of the achievements of 19th and 20th century restorers. We travel across Europe and Asia, admiring antiquity that was actually built at a time when our great-grandfathers were already reading newspapers and riding trains. This is not a conspiracy, but a cultural demand. In an era of rapid change, humanity desperately needed roots, and so it built them. The problem is not that the buildings are new, but that our memory was restored along with the stones. We believe in ideal Gothic, in the infallible masters of the past, and in linear progress, failing to notice the seams where eras meet. We live surrounded by stage sets passing themselves off as the foundation of civilization. History is not what actually happened, but what we managed to agree upon. And today, architecture is the primary tool of that agreement. The next time you touch an ancient wall, remember, perhaps beneath your fingers lies not the cold of eternity, but the concrete of the industrial age.